There was an article that I wrote when I was still at Substack, and it was in October of 2022. So it was roughly 4 months or so after my husband, the Congressman David Miranda, was hospitalized with a very severe intestinal infection that turned into sepsis and kept him in the hospital in the ICU unit for 9 months until he died in May of this year. And the reason I wrote the article was because prior to being hospitalized, David had left his party that he had been in for a long time because he didn't want to support the current president, Lula da Silva, in the first round of voting. He wanted to support a different candidate instead. He also had joined that party because it had always been an oppositional party to Lula's party, and it was quickly becoming subservient to the Democratic establishment, very similar to the conversation that I just had with Savvy about what happened to the Democratic Party. And so David left and he joined this political party, and it was a party much less imprisoned by dogma. That was a major reason David left it. And one of the people who ended up being in that party was Cabo Daciolo, who became this very famous and popular politician in 2010, I believe, when he led a firefighter strike. He was a firefighter. He's an evangelical. The Brazilian firefighters had pay that was barely at a subsistence level. They were risking their lives to rescue people in fires, and yet could barely afford food. Their pay was shockingly low. He led a strike. He became a very popular figure. He often used the gospel as a way of arguing for better treatment of the working class and for workers in Brazil. And the left was so thrilled to have him because he was an actual member of the working class, which the left all throughout the democratic world has great difficulty in attracting. They love academics who talk about the working class as this kind of species that they don't know much about, but they study and care about. But they have a lot of difficulty getting actual members of the working class. So they finally got Cabo Daciolo, a firefighter, an evangelical who talks openly about Christ and Christianity and the role it plays in his life. But even though he continued to support those economic causes and he got elected to Congress as a member of the same left-wing party to which my husband belonged, the fact that he opposed same-sex marriage on religious grounds, the fact that he refused to endorse it morally based on his same religious values, the fact that he thought that political rights were derived from God and not from the government, made him anathema to that party. He left, they expelled him, so they lost one of their only actual members of the working class. He ended up going to this same party and ended up kind of in a fluke in the same party as David, and they instantly formed this very close friendship. They just, in part because they kind of came from the same humble origins. David grew up in a favela. Cabo grew up quite poor. And so here you had David Miranda, one of the most visible LGBT members of Congress, one of the very few gay politicians in Brazilian politics in its history, openly celebrating his friendship with Cabo Daciolo, this evangelical leader who has not changed his position on same-sex marriage or LGBT rights at all. And I'll never forget the first day that David or Cabo, one of them, published their photo. They met at the airport. They talked for so long, they both missed their flight. And they posted pictures of themselves, a selfie they took, and David got viciously attacked by the left, saying, how is it possible that you can even speak with somebody, let alone express positive thoughts about someone who hates you, who hates gay people? If you go on the internet and look for Cabo Daciolo, where I mention him, the Brazilian left will tell you that he is a hateful person. When David was hospitalized, there was no shortage of politicians wanting to associate themselves with David for about a week. A lot of them wanted to call, visit David, have the media attention that came from the sympathy that's generated when somebody becomes sick. Cabo didn't disappear after the first or second week. He called me every week, wanting to know how David was, wanting to know how I was doing, wanting to bring his wife and kids to be with my kids. He went to the hospital and prayed over David when David wasn't conscious, prayed with David when David was. And this friendship that they formed was extremely meaningful, as was the role that he played in trying to provide my family and me with a lot of comfort, not just trying, but actually doing it. And then when David died, he kind of even increased his efforts even more. He's become a friend of our family. We're launching an institute in David's name next month, and he's playing a crucial role in it. And so I wrote this article. Here you see the title, Values and Character versus Political Identity, Some Personal Reflections. And I talked about that friendship and what it taught me. And I won't go into all of it. If you want and you're interested and you haven't read it, you can find it on Substack through this title. So the reason I'm talking about this is over the last night, Cabo's wife, I think they've been married for 30 years or something. They have 3 children they're raising together, passed away from leukemia. And he talked to me a lot about his wife's struggles with her illness, talked about how she lived a lot longer than her doctors said she would, how that strengthened his belief in God and attributed to his faith. And I think obviously in part it was due to his human decency, but in part because he empathized with our situation is one of the reasons that he wanted to give so much support. And I think he's thought his wife was getting better, and she took a massive downturn over the last several weeks and ended up hospitalized and passed away and left him as a single father raising 3 kids. So I was thinking a lot as that entered the news, and when I learned about it early this morning about this relationship, I've reached out to him, of course. And so I revisited that article that I wrote. I posted a condolences on my Twitter page and Instagram. We don't have them here, but there were some pictures that I posted of David and Cabo together, commemorating his wife, and just sharing some thoughts about what I felt about what this happened. In any event, what that really led me to do is it reminded me of a story that was really this is not the first time I understood that a person's worth and their value and their character is not determined by the political party to which they belong or the ideology they claim to believe in or the hashtags they post on Twitter. I've been around way too long to believe that someone's character and value and worth as a human being is determined by left or right or what political causes they support. I just seen, as you just heard Sabby saying, you have all kinds of progressives who love to flamboyantly express values that their personal actions simply don't align with. And that's true, I think, in every political faction. So I wanted to kind of share the first time I learned about that because I think it's such an important lesson. It's absolutely, a central perspective that shapes the show we do here, shapes my approach to politics and to people in general. I was in law school, my first year in law school at NYU. I was 23. I lived the last 4 years in Washington, D.C., where I went to college and took a year off and traveled around Europe and then went to live in New York. And I was in my first year of law school. And I had a roommate, and she started dating this guy, and it got serious enough, and he asked her to go visit his parents' house in Massachusetts. And she went. She spent the weekend at his house where his parents lived, and she came back, and she told me, with this kind of mischievous excitement, that her boyfriend's mother is a huge conservative. This is in the early 1990s, just coming out of the Reagan era. George H.W. Bush was president. And Rush Limbaugh was a very popular political commentator, very influential. And she told me her mother is a huge Rush Limbaugh fan. And this is right when the internet was just starting to emerge, kind of in the early to mid 1990s. And at the time, the internet was really just this series of segregated sites on AOL, CompuServe. There was one other, I forget the name, that was sort of the 3 biggest sites. So it was not really an internet that was connected. It was kind of siloed off. And within CompuServe, there was this right-wing political forum designed to allow conservatives to congregate with one another, to meet, to chat, to debate, to discuss. And my roommate told me that his mother was part of this site. It was run, I believe, by National Review and the Heritage Foundation. It was called Town Hall. Rush Limbaugh used to promote it all the time. She came back very mischievously and she said, you need to go in there and troll people and provoke them. And at the time, my view of religious conservatives especially, but conservatives in general, but religious conservatives as well, because I grew up in a working class neighborhood, but in South Florida, where there weren't a lot of religious conservatives. South Florida, for those of you who know it, is more like Southern New York. But more so, my early adult years formed living in Washington, D.C. and then New York City. I very much was part of this left liberal cultural milieu. And I looked at social conservatives in particular, religious conservatives in particular, as people full of hate and basically people who were kind of primitive, had a sort of superiority complex that enabled me or caused me to look down at people like that, which is very much something that I picked up from the cultural milieu in which I was existing in these East Coast colleges and in these cities. And I did go into this forum with the intention purely to provoke people, to say, I'm gay, I'm a gay lawyer in New York, to go in and argue with them about LGBT issues and about abortion and about cultural issues and Reagan and Bush. And I went in there with the worst intentions, just to cause problems and to upset people. And what I found was over the course of the few weeks that I was doing that, I started noticing that these kinds of attempts to provoke and upset people slowly started to morph into kind of earnest debates with people who I was finding, to my great shock, weren't really actually stupid and primitive, but were actually very smart and informed. And I started feeling like some of these debates were actually worth having, that they were challenging, that they were intellectually challenging for me and difficult for me, and that I was talking to a lot of people who, to my shock, were not at all the caricatures that I had been trained to think of them being. And then over the course of a few more months, I found that not only was that happening more commonly, but I was actually now engaging in kind of interpersonal interaction. There were direct messages where people could direct message you if you were online, and you ended up talking to them privately, and that began to happen as well. And this was the time when the internet was completely anonymous. People used screen names. Almost nobody used their real names. So the second month that I was in there, when I was still kind of in the provocative mood, they had what was their annual get-together, where they would physically gather in one place so that they could deal with each other as human beings and not just screen names. Obviously, I didn't even think about going. I was still there just to provoke them, thinking they were going to hate me, wanted to kill me. And so the next year, I was now there for a full year, obviously getting to know these people personally. We were on almost every day. The annual meeting was being held in Indiana, in a Hilton or a Holiday Inn in a suburb of Indianapolis. And some of them began saying, oh, you should come. And I remember telling my friends, you know what, I'm considering going to this meeting of these right-wing people who I'd gone in to provoke and kind of had gotten to know. And I remember people saying, are you crazy? You can't go to Indiana and meet a bunch of religious conservatives. They're going to kill you. And I remember thinking, I probably thought that a year earlier, but I actually don't think that anymore. And I decided to go, and I went. And it was just one of the best weekends I had ever had. I have had. They were incredibly warm and welcoming. It was this experience that was still very new, where you met people and got to know people on the internet, which was still a very unusual and novel experience. And then you got to like actually attach a human being to those people, those screen names with whom you had been arguing and fighting. And I could not have been more warmly received. Everybody was incredibly friendly to me. I'm talking here about social conservatives, religious conservatives in the early 1990s, who encountered me because I purposely went in to provoke them, to provoke their hatred and their anger and their rage. I didn't go in there with good intentions at all. And they didn't change their views about LGBT issues or any of the political issues they were arguing about and believed in, just like Cabo Daciolo didn't change his political views when he formed this friendship with David, and then with so much generosity and spiritual support, provided so much support for our family during our most difficult time. They just saw me as a human being, and I saw them as human beings. And ideology and political party just didn't play a role in it. Once you get to know a human being, you search for the things in which you have in common with them. And it just taught me a huge lesson about stereotypes and caricatures of people that media encourages us to adopt about one another. And it's something that has stayed with me forever. It's something I think that I've tried to adhere to as much as possible. The Young Turks, which is this, for those of you who don't know what that is, be very thankful, but they have this segment where they send people, it's a left-wing YouTube show, a Democratic Party YouTube show, kind of the Bernie AOC crowd that we were just talking about. They send people to Trump rallies, and they stick cameras and microphones in front of Trump voters, Trump supporters, and the whole point is just to mock them. Like most of the time, they're not saying anything embarrassing, but because they look a certain way, because they express themselves a certain way, because they have a MAGA hat, you're obviously, if you're a liberal, trained to look down on those people like I did in my early 20s before I had these personal experiences that dispelled these stereotypes. And one of the things they've been doing is when they've been going to these rallies, there are people, they ask them, where do you get your news from? Where do you get your source of information from? And a lot of them will say Matt Taibbi, a lot of them will say independent media, and a lot of them will name me. And there was this one video that they were passing around that they thought was going to be incriminating for me because it showed that at least part of my audience are adherents to Donald Trump and to the MAGA movement. And this was one of the women who they interviewed, and I think I know that they clearly thought that this made me look bad because they were constantly throwing it around the internet and putting it into forums where I'm criticized and even putting it into my Twitter mentions as some sort of proof that I have become corrupted. And here's what this person said. This is from the Young Turks in August of this year where they went to a Trump rally.
Research, do it yourself. You know, you can go on the internet and find, non-partial people like Glenn Greenwald, things like that.
So Glenn's a nonpartisan?
Oh, yeah, I would say he's nonpartisan leaning towards being a liberal.
Okay, honestly, I love that woman. I don't know who she is. I don't know anything else about her, but I could just tell what her spirit is by having watched her say that. I couldn't be more thrilled that I'm able to reach people of a wide, diverse range of views. I know there's a lot of leftists in my audience, a lot of people who are independents, a lot of people who are Trump supporters, a lot of people who are libertarians. That has always been true of my audience. It's more true now. It's something I celebrate and I think is one of the most important parts of our show, that we are not siloed into ideological camps, that we can have dialogue with people. The reality is, in my early 20s, before that experience happened, I probably would have looked at this woman, made judgments about how she looked, about her simplicity. She doesn't look like she came out of a CNN green room or out of a faculty lounge at an Ivy League school, and I probably would have made judgments about her that this video and videos like it are intended to foster among people who are liberals to think about Trump supporters as barely human. And that experience with Cabo, the fact that I obviously kind of reconnected to that, those sentiments as a result of the passing away of his wife overnight, for which I obviously have a lot of empathy, I thought was a good opportunity just to kind of explain how I think we try and understand people, how our politics are shaped. I think Sabby actually talked about it extremely well when talking about how a lot of black voters are now abandoning the Democratic Party, are actually starting to vote for Trump, realizing that their interests are not being served, that the working class has a lot of interest in common and have the same kind of enemies, but they're purposely kept separated. And the ability to overcome those differences, not to judge people based on ideology, to judge them based on their character and their values as reflected not by hashtags and political slogans, but by their actions and their lives, I think it's one of the most crucial things we do. And I think it's the thing that, if anything, is probably the centerpiece of how we try and do our show here. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.